When you make it into the NFL, there's one thing that is guaranteed to happen at some point in time, no matter who you are. Your successor will be taken. Father Time is undefeated, and you will be replaced at some point. Maybe it's through free agency with a younger or a better player. Or maybe it's through the draft with a cheaper option who is significantly younger than you. Maybe it's because you're bad, or maybe it's because you're on the decline, or maybe it's because the board fell a certain way to the point where the team couldn't pass up taking that player. Maybe it's a long overdue move, or maybe it's a move that feels incredibly premature, a la Tommy Maddox getting drafted by the Denver Broncos in 1992, with John Elway still in his prime. But at some point, no matter who you are going to be replaced with someone else. However, of all the ways in NFL history through the NFL draft that this has happened, it's tough to find one more awkward than this. Because the man you've been watching this entire time is St. Louis Cardinals wide receiver Sonny Randle. And we'll get to how good he was and how impactful he was in just a little bit. However, at the 1967 NFL-AFL combined draft, the Cardinals decided to draft his replacement and draft his successor in the most awkward way possible. How awkward was this move? Well, let's just say that I can't see a scenario like this ever playing out again. And it was a move that summed up the bizarre ending to Randle's career with the Cardinals, which was bizarre enough as it was. Because this is the story behind what might just be the most awkward draft pick that you never knew about. Be sure to hit that like button down below, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single video that we post on the channel. We post every single day on here about the weird and the wacky history of the NFL and the NFL draft with stories like this one. So if you like that sort of stuff, then this is the place for you. Thanks in advance for your support as we try and grow this community of football lovers and historians even more. And with that in mind, let's talk about the draft pick that led to not so sunny skies ahead for Sonny Randle. Before I talk about the actual pick in question, who he was, and what made this incredibly awkward, we need some context to understand just who Sonny Randle was in the first place, and why the Cards were thinking of drafting his successor to begin with. Oddly enough, I've already done a pretty in-depth video on Sonny Randle and his impact with the team, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. I'm not going to regurgitate too much of that information, so go check that video out if you haven't already, as there will be a link in the description too. However, here is a brief summation of Randle, his impact, and his subsequent fall-off, just for some background. Going into the 1966 season, Sonny Randle was one of the best receivers in the history of the National Football League, and that is something that I do not say lightly. The man was a four-time Pro Bowler with over 5,000 yards receiving and 58 touchdowns, and was inside the top 10 of the NFL in receiving touchdowns all time, and inside the top 25 all time in both receiving yards and receptions. His 1960 season, where he found the end zone 15 times, was the third best season by any receiver in NFL history from a receiving touchdown standpoint at the time. And he had multiple seasons of over 1,000 receiving yards, which is impressive for any player, let alone a player in the 1960s when the passing game was not what it is today and when the season was significantly shorter. However, when 1966 rolled around and Randle hit 30 years old, he seemingly fell off of a cliff. Part of it was due to a broken right hand that derailed him for the first half of the season, and part of it was that he just flat out stunk. He wasn't as fast and dropped everything thrown his way after that, including an infamous game against the San Francisco 49ers where he dropped 8 passes, which I break down in that previous video. By the time the 1966 season was done, Randle had just 17 receptions for 218 yards and 2 touchdowns, all of which were his worst totals since he was a 19th round rookie in 1959, and the Cardinals were in Chicago. He went from inside the top 10 in just about every major category the year before in 1965 to outside the top 40 in receiving touchdowns and hovering around 70th in receptions and receiving yards. It was very clear that Sonny Randle was not the same player that he once was, and that Father Time was not going to be kind to him from a playing standpoint. But remember that this was the 1960s that we were talking about, and the NFL was not the lucrative business that it is today. What do I mean by that? Just about every single player in the league worked a second job. There were some exceptions, but players worked various positions in the offseason to prepare for life after football and to make a living, since their NFL contracts weren't necessarily enough. Heck, Baltimore Colts quarterback Earl Morrall almost retired after the 1968 season when he won the MVP, because he had a huge business opportunity with his offseason job that he couldn't pass up. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Some players took time in the offseason to go back to school and get a law degree. Some players worked in banks and brokerages. Some players worked labor-intensive jobs, and some owned their own business. However, some players decided to pursue careers in the media, and that's exactly what this man right here, Sonny Randle, did. Randle was a busy man, as he was already working as the track and field coach at a local high school. But Randle wanted to pursue a career in broadcasting, and he got a head start on that while he was playing. After getting injured during the 1964 season, Randle kept himself busy by joining KSD, which today is the NBC affiliate for St. Louis. And he was a big part of the network, serving as the sportscaster and serving in a few other roles. He not only had a sports radio program in the morning, but he had a show at 4:30 and another show at 6:20. So he was on the air in some capacity 3 times a day. And after Randle retired and his days as a coach were done, he would get back into broadcasting and would do that for over 30 years before his death in 2017. So the man enjoyed that line of work and loved what he did. You're going to see why his broadcasting career is relevant in just a little bit, because I promise you, the payoff is going to be worth it. Back to his playing days though. Like I said before, after the 1966 season, Randle was older and wasn't as good as he used to be. And no one could deny that. Which is why the St. Louis Cardinals were potentially looking for a replacement at the 1967 draft if the board fell a certain way. And sure enough, the board fell perfectly for them. Because when it was time for the Cards to make their pick in the first round, with pick number 16, they chose this man right here, Washington wide receiver Dave Williams. The Husky wideout was dominant during his heyday, as the year before he got drafted, in 1965, Williams led the entire conference, the AAWU, with 10 receiving touchdowns and 21 yards per catch, all while finishing inside the top 10 of the NCAA with nearly 800 receiving yards. To show you how dominant Williams was, in 1965, the Washington Huskies threw 14 touchdown passes and 1,458 yards. And 10 of the touchdowns and 795 of the yards were caught by Williams, meaning that he accounted for 55% of the team's receiving yards and 71% of the team's receiving touchdowns. Imagine single-handedly accounting for a team's passing offense. And that's what Williams was doing out in the Pacific Northwest in the mid-60s. And to give credit to this man right here, Dave Williams had a pretty solid career in the NFL. I don't know if I would call it spectacular by any means, but at least for the first few years of his career prior to the merger, he was an extremely solid receiver. He finished second in the AP Offensive Rookie of the Year voting in 1967, only behind Detroit Lions back Mel Farr. You can learn more about the bizarre voting process for the 1967 Rookie of the Year by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Seeing as the quarterback that was throwing Williams the ball, Jim Hart, got some votes for Rookie of the Year that season, despite not even being a rookie. And in 1969, Williams had over 700 receiving yards and finished inside the top 5 in the NFL with 56 receptions. Over his first 3 seasons in the NFL, Dave Williams had 127 receptions for 1,789 yards and 18 touchdowns. For some perspective on how good the start to his career was, over that time frame from 1967 to 69, Williams was 13th in the NFL in combined receptions and receiving touchdowns, and was 16th in receiving yards, so he was up there with some of the best. On top of that, Williams was one of just 10 players in NFL history at the time to have over 125 receptions and 18 receiving touchdowns over his first 3 seasons, as only a select few players ever got off to as good of a start as he did. It's a pretty exclusive company, with guys like Mike Ditka, Charlie Taylor, Tom Fears, and Bob Hayes being on that list. So Williams and the Cardinals did quite well for themselves with that pick, even if the production fell off steeply after the merger. Of course, in true Cardinals fashion, the man chosen before Williams was arguably the greatest defensive tackle of all time, Alan Page, as he was chosen 15th by the Minnesota Vikings. And the man chosen after Williams was arguably the greatest guard of all time, Gene Upshaw, as he was chosen 17th by the Oakland Raiders. So Williams had the misfortune of being sandwiched in between two of the greatest to ever do it. But still, Williams was a very solid receiver for a period of time, and he helped the Cardinals in their passing game out tremendously throughout the late 1960s. Having said that, when the Cardinals drafted this man right here in Dave Williams, it signaled something very clear. It signaled that Sonny Randle's time with the team was coming to an end. After nearly a decade with the organization, and after being one of the best receivers in football throughout the first half of the 1960s, it seemed as though Sonny Randle was going to have his time come up. As is customary both today and back then, after the first round pick is made, the media has an interview with the coach to discuss the logic and the thought process behind the pick. Usually, these interviews are pretty ho-hum and are generic coach speak. You hear things like, "We liked the way the board fell to us," and "We liked his character and couldn't pass him up," and "We're excited to get to work with him, and I like what he's going to bring to this team." You've heard it all before. And as is customary, these questions are asked by reporters. And usually, they are local reporters for the local news stations. And I'm sure you can see where this one is going. Because the man that was covering the NFL draft for KSD, the man that was going to have to ask head coach Charlie Winter about the decision to draft Dave Williams, you guessed it, this man right here, Sonny Randle. And folks, I'm not sure it gets more awkward than this. In essence, Randle was conducting his own exit interview. As a journalist and as the sports reporter, he was responsible for interviewing Charlie Winter about the thought process behind the move right after it happened. And keep in mind, this was 1967 that we were talking about here. The NFL draft was not the phenomenon that it is today, where you have hundreds of reporters on the scene. It was an untelevised event that was not paid attention to much by the average NFL fan, and it was not an event that commanded a ton of coverage. This meant that, from everything I could find, this was a one-on-one interview. Sonny Randle was all by himself with no one to relieve him. Randle was going to have to ask Winter immediately after being blindsided and shell-shocked by the pick why on earth the Cardinals did it, and why the Cardinals were looking to replace him. In other words, imagine if the New Orleans Saints draft Shedeur Sanders, and immediately after, Derek Carr is to sit down with the coaching staff in the front office and interview them for 10 minutes uninterrupted about why that happened. Well, that's what Sonny Randle had to do here. As Winter said in the interview to Randle, "We need a good young split end to go along with our vets. You are going on your 9th year, and Bobby Joe Conrad is heading for his 10th. We needed a youngster coming up." I'm going to guess that this is the only post-draft interview in NFL history where the coach referred to a reporter in the second person when talking about why a move was made. But the answer was about what you'd expect. Randle was getting old. Williams was a new face and was young. It was time for a change. Winter basically said to Randle, "We're looking to replace you." Randle joked with Winter to end the interview by saying, "Don't trade me until I get back to St. Louis." But to the surprise of no one, shortly after, Randle was traded away by the St. Louis Cardinals to the San Francisco 49ers in exchange for a draft choice. Randle's time with the Cardinals was up. He knew the writing was on the wall, and with his job as a reporter for KSD, in essence, he had to attend and plan his own funeral. Randle handled it with about as much class as possible, but obviously, that's a fine line that is extremely tough to do. KSD had no idea when they were having Randle conduct the interview that the Cardinals were going to draft a wide receiver. The move came out of nowhere. If you're a reporter and you don't ask follow-up questions and push the interviewee on the matter, if there's an answer that needs clarification, you're not doing your job and serving your audience. However, there's a clear conflict of interest here, And if you do that here, while you are doing your job, you're going to cause conflict with the coach and might get reprimanded and punished in some way. This is one of those cases of you can't serve two masters that Randle handled very well, all things considered. And I'm sure it wasn't easy for Coach Winter either, knowing who conducted the interview and knowing that everything he said needed to be construed perfectly so as not to disrespect Randle and his contributions to the team over the years. The fact that the Cardinals drafted a wide receiver and drafted the replacement of this man right here, Sonny Randle, after all his contributions with the team over the years, by itself isn't awkward. Because again, that happens all the time. The fact that it happened and the man who had to conduct the interview was the man who was being replaced, I don't think we're going to see that again. Partly because of how the draft is covered today, and partly because of the nature of football contracts today, not necessitating players working second jobs in the offseason. Because on this day in 1967, between the pick itself and the interview afterwards that he had to conduct as part of his job, let's just say that the forecast for Sonny was extremely cloudy. Be sure to like and subscribe if you have not done so already, as it helps the channel out a lot, and check out my other channels, JG8 for the history of college football, JG7 for the history of baseball, and JG9 News, where we talk about all things happening in the NFL. Join me every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, where we'll play live NFL trivia for cash prizes. And make sure to join me live, as we're on stream just about every single day. And thanks to all our Patreon members and our YouTube members for helping out the channel. See how you become a member and show your support financially in the description down below.